Hello everyone and welcome to this Cambridge Chem webinar. Good morning, good afternoon and good evening wherever you are in the world today. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we start, I just want to go through a couple of housekeeping points with you all. You may have noticed that your microphones are muted. They will stay on mute as we go through the session to avoid any background noise. Natasha, John and I are also hosting this webinar from home, so if there are any issues with our internet connection, please bear with us. There'll be a question and answer session at the end of the webinar, so please post any questions or comments you'd like to ask in the questions box as we go through the webinar. If you're having any technical difficulties with either sound or video, please just let me know in the questions box and I'll do my best to resolve them. We recommend that you use headphones to listen to this session for the best sound quality. We are also recording the webinar and we will send the video recording and slides to you via email straight to your inbox next week. We will also send you a certificate of attendance 1 hour after the webinar has finished. So I'm delighted to be joined by my colleagues John and Natasha to talk through this session on an introduction to baseline assessment. And now over to you, John.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kate. Well, nice to meet everybody again, wherever you are in the world. We're going to do this a little bit, I think, back to front. So Natasha and I are going to pass ourselves backwards and forwards. So we're going to start with me a little bit, which is obviously myself down the bottom. Now, I've worked in a variety of sectors over the years. I started my career in media and consulting as much as anything. And in that time, I developed a real kind of niche, if you like, for the use of data to inform decision making throughout the course of business. And that was across a range of industries, across a range of verticals that you've got in a range of different sectors. And using all of that information, using that data to develop decision making over the course of my career is something that's actually transferred and translated quite nicely into my time here at Chem. And this is something that I'd like to share with you today. So I'm going to hand over very briefly for Natasha to introduce herself, and then I'll take over again, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you, John. So good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. So yeah, as John said, we both love data, and I think for me, I mean, I've always been in education since I started my career back in 2008. I started off in the classroom teaching English as a foreign language, and I did that for a few years, and then did teacher training. And to be honest, actually, the first time I really came across a baseline assessment, because we didn't really use these sorts of assessments in my context, was when I started at Chem about 2.5 years ago. So I know what it's like to be brand new to baseline data in particular, even though I'd used data for other purposes before. So hopefully from today, you'll come away with a few ideas of, especially if you're new, or even if you've been using it for a while, what can I actually do with baseline data from a teaching perspective or from a leadership perspective as well. So looking forward to speaking to you a little bit later on, but for now, I'll be back to you, John.
Lovely, thanks, Natasha. And just a quick one before we really dive into the content. But Natasha and I are here to help. And if you're anything like me, please don't leave your questions until the end. Even though you're muted, please just pop your questions into that questions box that you should see on, I think it's your left-hand side anyway. The questions, I think Kate, who's curating for us, will either get to as we're going through the webinar, or we're going to address them at the end as well. Anything that we don't get addressed at the end, obviously, we'll get back to you individually afterwards. So, without further ado, are you missing a crucial piece? Now, I'm going to start with a little story. And my story starts when I left media and consulting and I trained to teach. And because of my background, the head of year 7, where I trained to teach, was keen to take on any help that she could get in terms of understanding the data that came through for transition, so the incoming year 7s. And what was actually quite frightening from my point of view is that by this point I'd understood that schools were real data generating machines. But what I didn't know is, at the time, and what I was quite surprised to find, was that a lot of that data, in a lot of cases, was either subjective or inconsistent or used in a variety of different ways. So for a transition, we were getting a new cohort of year 7s, and they were coming from a variety of different schools, a variety of different institutions. And all of the data that came with those students was, I'm going to say inconsistent is probably the nicest way to put it, because the head of year 7 at the time, she would do this mental filtering, this mental weighting. So whether she thought she knew some schools inflated some of the figures, or whether some schools were a little bit inconsistent in their application, or some were on point, or some might be a little bit low. And so she would mentally do this weighting, this filtering at the time as you were getting the students through. And obviously, this was all down to, well, we need to make sure we're getting the students in the correct classes. We want to make sure that the students are supported most effectively. We want to make sure that we know where we're going. And even when the students started, we had this strange period where we were doing spelling tests, so we were doing math tests, and this was all to try and find this starting point. Where are we starting from? Because we all know, where the curriculum wants to lead us to. We all know where we need to get the students to, and we all know all of the tools and the resources that we've got to help us get the student along that path. But we need to figure out where we're starting from, because in order to plot a course between 2 points, you need exactly that. You need 2 points. You can't just have the journey and then the end point. You need the start point and an end point. And this is where I think Ken comes in. And if I could have had something like Ken, I think when I taught, it would have been quite fascinating. I was once given a piece of advice by the same head of year 7, by the way, that you should never smile before Christmas. And that was her nice way of saying that that first 3 months, that start of an academic year, is a voyage of discovery. It's a voyage of discovery for yourself, because you need to understand the students that you've got in front of you, their strengths, their weaknesses, how they need to be supported. But also the students need to understand you, how you work and your flow within the classroom, and the level of expectations that you've got as you go through. So having this journey and having so much that you need to find out, and often in quite a manual way. We used to have teaching assistants marking spelling and math tests throughout the course of these first month, I think, when we desperately tried to create a more consistent and reliable measure for students as they were coming into the class, coming into the school. And obviously, anytime we had a student coming into the school outside of that main influx, we need to make sure that they were tested as well. So this is quite an interesting point where often at school, you don't necessarily realize initially that you've got a gap, but very quickly you realize that, okay, well, I need certain points of information that are going to help me inform decision making as I go through the academic year. Okay, and at the start, it's often really quite critical. So often this is a very simple way of looking at it, but the first thing you do is you assess, and you're going to assess using a variety of different tools. You're going to look at a lot of the data sources that you've already got, the information that comes in sort of naturally and generally. But within that, you're going to find that there will be some gaps. There always are. There will be some inconsistencies that you don't necessarily have 100% trust in. So what you want to do is fill those gaps, and you look to fill those gaps as quickly as possible. So you assess. Now, once you've got your data, obviously, because we don't just assess and then leave it as a dusty tome on a shelf, we analyze that data, and we take that. We say, well, where does that end? What does that tell us? What does the data tell us? Are there any inconsistencies? Because often when you assess and when you analyze the data, you don't necessarily answer all of your questions, but often you start asking the right ones. It's certainly shining a light in the corners where you really want to be focusing and spending a bit more attention, which leads us on to the next point, which is act. Because what's the point in assessing and then analyzing the data if you're not going to do anything with it? Okay, that's great. But now you've got data, and you can start to develop these well-informed plans that are going to be able to help you allocate resources very efficiently and very effectively, but also make a very tailored and very personal journey that is most appropriate to each and every student that you've got on your role. Now, why we're here from a school leader point of view, well, this is quite simple. You want to be able to measure the success of your strategies. You want to be able to use data to inform decision making from the top right the way down, not just in the classroom, but also from a whole school level. You want to be able to benchmark success consistently and effectively as you're going through the course of the academic year. And importantly as well, you need to be able to manage that journey, not just over the course of a single academic year, but multiple academic years. Now, it's this journey that's going to help you do your lessons learned. What have I done well? What have I done not so well? What should I be repeating? What should I be stopping doing? Now, by doing that, you're also going to filter down benefits to the teacher. So what can a teacher do with these benchmarking information? Well, obviously, you're going to use it to set targets. That's great. But you can do 1,000,001 other things with it. By understanding strengths and weaknesses of individual students as they're coming through and their very personal profiles, you're actually going to give the classroom teachers the opportunity to inform everything from differentiated activities in the classroom to seating plans, to group activities, to the variety of different resources and materials that the teacher can then prepare ahead of time. So you're not going into this cold, you're actually going into this equipped with some real quality data to help you understand how you're going to evidence the development for each and every student that you've got in your classroom. I was once told that especially in your training year, you need to be able to demonstrate how you're differentiating your practice for each and every student in the classroom. So you obviously need to know which students need what input. And part of that was based on the grades that they were currently operating at, any information that came from the SENCO, any information that came from various other parts, the SATs results, if the student had them when they came in, or any other baseline measure that you might have. So where did the student fit, and what might the student most likely be required? What's your classroom going to look like, and how is it going to flow over time? How are you going to manage it? Now, my old manager once said to me as well, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. It's perhaps not strictly true, but if you can measure it, it certainly makes it an awful lot easier. Now, I'm going to pause at this point, and I think Kate's going to put us up a quick poll. So, what assessments does your school currently use? Now, I know for a fact that every school that you've got, every school out there often uses a very different way of doing it. There's a variety and a range of in-house solutions. As I said before, we used to use these spelling tests and these math tests, and they were quite interesting because these spelling tests and math tests were delivered twice in an academic year. Often once at the start and once about halfway through. And these tests were often used to place students in their different sets based on their different levels of ability. But it was quite bizarre. I mean, these tests were identical all the time, every year. So, first sitting, second sitting, every year group, everyone sat the same test. It was quite frightening to myself looking at it. It was one of those strange periods where, as a former manager of data, as a former utilizer of data, I suppose in previous sectors, to actually have these rather inconsistent measures over the course of the year was quite strange. And then we had obviously data based on observations, but then a lot of the data based on the observations actually wasn't supported by additional assessment. So we would be using subjective data alongside objective data inconsistently throughout the course of the year. So obviously this became a bit of an itch that we can't scratch. I think are we sharing? Are we sharing the results of the poll?
I'll share them with you now.
Yeah, thanks, Kate.
Hopefully you can see that, John.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can see that two-thirds of everybody here were using teacher developed assessments, and that is exactly what we had when I taught. I think seemingly half are using checkpoint, almost half using progression tests as well. So, and about a quarter using other baseline assessments, which is often a profile that we find quite consistent as you go through and you look. Often the focus is very much on attainment. We test attainment, so it's obviously it's what we're doing. It's why we're here. We're testing attainment along a particular curriculum, but actually providing those consistent baselines can be quite important. So it's really nice having a range that we've got here, and often the profile like that isn't uncommon. So what have we got here? So we're talking about Chem. So with Natasha and I from Chem, or the Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring, and what we do is we try and help schools out there understand a bit more about the core skills that students have when they join them in particular. Now, we're looking at insights into numeracy in particular, verbal ability, and also non-verbal ability. Now, in each of the developmental stages, whether that's early years, primary, secondary, even through to post-16 study, each of those areas, even though the core of what we're trying to test remains quite consistent, often the stages need to be quite consistent in terms of what we do, in terms of what we assess. So we want to be able to make sure that you're able to raise those expectations, but also, make them very aspirational while being realistic. We obviously want you to be able to benefit the students in the classroom as well, but we also importantly want the school to become a much more effective and a much more efficient place for you to operate. So we know that a quarter of you have already used baselines already, but from your point of view, what is a baseline? And this is, I think, a conversation that is often it differs over time, depending on who you talk to. So pop them in the questions box. And while you're popping them in the questions box, I'm going to talk a little bit about baseline. I'm going to talk a little bit about what my experience of baseline has been, not just in teaching, but actually pre-teaching as well, because even though we're talking about teaching, there are some certain parallels here. It'd be interesting as well to know, if you pop in your question box, what do you use the baseline assessments for? What do you use the data for? If you don't use a baseline assessment, well, have you got an itch that you can't scratch? Is there a gap that you're looking to fill? And those, I think, are the interesting questions that you've got, especially when you start interrogating your data. So again, baseline objectives. So what is a baseline assessment? Well, if you boil it down to the most simple point, okay, a baseline is a clearly defined starting point. Okay, now you can go to any dictionary, you're going to find a number of different definitions, but it's a clearly defined starting point, and that's what we're here to talk about, and that's often what we're trying to do. Now, the good ones, the good baselines, are objective and repeatable, okay, because you want that consistency of measure. Now, in this context, because obviously we're talking about schools, we're going to be looking at, we want to give you a high quality measure of students' aptitude and skills that are going to be critical to the academic success as a student moves forward. So, as we said before, verbal, numeric, and the non-verbal. Now, the tests that we're going to talk about a little bit later, the assessments that we're going to do, they're often delivered at the start of or the beginning of a journey. So, which is, I said before, in the year 7, often it's that transition point. But it's not just at the start of an academic year. Now, many of you, I'm guessing, will have rolling admissions programs. So you have students coming to you at a variety of points throughout the course of the year. There may be a gap in learning. There may have been a lockdown. You may have been teaching at home. There may have been inconsistency in the data. There's all sorts of reasons why you might end up either with no data, inconsistent data, or fragmented data. Now, if you ever feel as though you're at a point where you've got exactly that kind of gap. Well, that's exactly the kind of point where you want to fill with a baseline assessment, because you almost starting again, or at the very least you've got a measure where you need to pause. Where are we now? Where do we need to get to? And it's at this point, and I think some of those insights that we'll see in the questions a bit later on are going to be quite telling as well. Now, I think it's at this point I'm going to turn myself off and hand over to Natasha.
Thank you, John. So yeah, so from what John was saying, I hope it's clear that baseline assessment is not designed to replace any other type of assessment that you might be using, for example, a checkpoint or progression test or internal curriculum-based assessments. Cambridge Chem baseline assessments are designed to be used as part of a holistic approach to planning, teaching, and also the insights can be used at a leadership level as well. You don't have to be using the Cambridge pathway or CEP or press resources to use Chem baseline assessments, but schools who have already started using Cambridge Chem assessments, who are existing Cambridge schools, have found them invaluable in informing teaching and learning at the start of each Cambridge course. And one example that often teachers tell me in different ways is, you've got a large classroom, maybe 25, 30 students. I remember from being in the classroom, it's often very easy to spot, who are the very able students, who are the students who are really struggling, but you've got that kind of mass of students in the middle, most of whom seem to be doing, fine. And for example, let's say you've got a quiet 8-year-old who, seems to be doing okay. How do you know if that 8-year-old is actually underperforming according to their potential? They could actually be doing a little bit better, or on the other hand, they might actually be working really, really hard just to keep up and get to the level that they're at. So how do you know if that child needs significant support or actually maybe a little bit more stretching, especially if you've had quite a lot of time outside of school? So Cambridge Chem baseline assessments can help you answer some of those types of questions because it focuses on skills rather than curriculum knowledge. And then you can tailor your teaching or whole school plans with the help of this information. And on the next slide, I just wanted to sum up that this is an external, computer-based adaptive assessment, which is curriculum-free and assesses those core skills which we know through our research are the foundation for doing well across all subjects. Here on this slide, I'm based in the Middle East, North Africa region, so but I'm sure it's pretty similar maybe for a lot of you. You might have students coming to you from a variety of different educational backgrounds, whether that's government or national curriculum, whether it's international schools in the country itself where you're based, or other in your region. So for me, it would be Gulf, or maybe it could be Southeast Asia, wherever you are. Some schools or some students might have had a lot of tutoring in the past. I know that's quite common where I am. So all these factors will have an effect on how well a student does, particularly in curriculum-based assessments. But having a baseline assessment, which is curriculum-free, what we're trying to do is put those students on a level playing field as possible. And because the questions are not specific to US curriculum or British curriculum or whatever it might be. So next we're going to look at what assessing these skills actually looks like. So the information that you get is pretty much the same from age 3 to 9. But as you can imagine, with different ages, there's different types of questions and reports because students at different ages, they can do different things. And here are the main areas that you'll get information on for each age group to give you data at the beginning and throughout the school year. So the three main modules, which you can see in those bubbles at the top, and this is no matter what their age, but of course they'll look a little bit different depending on which year group you're looking at. So you've got, the first one is reading or vocabulary, then you've got mathematics, and then you've got non-verbal or developability, which we call it in INCAS. Just a quick note on what developability and non-verbal actually is, because we get asked that a lot, so it might be new to you. Developability in INCAS primary is what we also call the capacity to learn. We use questions to assess how good a student is at picking up new skills. So how quickly are they likely to learn new things during class. And this section includes picture vocabulary and also non-verbal ability. So things like logic and reasoning, that kind of thing. And I think it's particularly useful to look at this if you're in an international school setting and you've got students who, I know a lot of my schools that I work with, you've got a lot of students who don't speak English as a first language, and their English skills are not yet developed enough to fully take on the curriculum and the lessons. And students with low English ability, that can sometimes mask their potential and their true ability, because if you can imagine a child, even in something like maths or science, if they don't have developed enough English skills, they're unlikely to be excelling in those subjects. So the non-verbal or the developability can help you sometimes differentiate between students who need support in general and students who it's more of a case that it's their English level which is holding them back. And when you get to Midgis and Yellis and Alice in secondary, it's more non-verbal. This is the ability to analyse information and solve problems using reasoning and logic. And in a Chem baseline assessment, typically that's tested using shapes and pattern-related visual questions to test visual and spatial skills. So now we're going to be looking at a couple of question types and a further look at those 6 assessments in a little bit more detail. I know they've all got different names and it might be new to you, so just to recap, the 6 assessments, they are specifically made to target each age group, each year group. We've got aspects, base and INCAS in primary and pre-primary, and then we've got Midgis, Yellis and Alice in secondary and post-16. So aspects, first of all, that's for your students who are aged 3 to 4, so possibly their first time that they've ever been in an educational setting. I've got a son who's 3. We don't want to be stressing children out or making things look daunting. We want them to be almost not realizing that it is an assessment, which is why we've made this assessment story-based. It's quite colourful, age-appropriate. It's only 10 to 15 minutes long, so of course we wouldn't expect children of that age to be doing something really long, and they don't even really have to touch the computer either. They would just point to the question, sorry, the answer that they think is the right one, and the teacher would be entering the answer that the child gives. What's quite nice about this one as well is you also get progress test at the end, so you can actually see how much progress a child has made throughout their time with you. It's similar when we get to base, but for this, reception year, or FS2 as it's sometimes called, we've got a little bit more detail, and you get more detailed reports books as well. So it's a little bit longer, but still it's one-to-one with the teacher. I quite like this because I think it gives the teacher a good 20 minutes of one-to-one time, consistent one-to-one time with each student. So you're not just looking at, do they recognize this shape, or do they recognize that letter, but what's their eye contact like? What's their communication like? Do they seem to be understand and just find it difficult to respond? So it gives teachers access to really quality time with students as well. And of course, it's not just about literacy and numeracy skills, but it's also personal, social, and emotional development that we're looking at as well. And again, you've got progress tests at the end of year if you want, and you can actually see how much progress has been made throughout the school year. When we get to INCAS, which is the primary assessment, at this point we might expect children to be able to use a computer independently, of course with a little bit with help, but that's why you can actually do this computer in let's say in a classroom setting, and you get really, really detailed data, because we've got 6 modules, about 20 minutes each. You can do them when you want, in the order that you want, and we're looking at those, if you remember, those key areas. So we're looking at reading, mathematics, developability, and also other areas like spelling, etc. This one is done once a year, and you get a really detailed profile of the strengths and weaknesses. So it's not just you'll get, this is their reading score and this is their math score, but you'll actually get the sub skills as well. So for reading, it might be word decoding, word recognition and comprehension, and maths, it's things like data handling and measurement, shape and space. So you can actually see, okay, here's my overall reading and math score, but actually which elements, which sub skills in particular is this student excelling in or needs a little bit more support in. And at this stage, the assessments are completely adaptive. So you don't have a situation where you've got a child who's sitting trying to do this assessment. Half the questions for one child might be too easy. For another child, they're sitting there because a lot of the questions are too difficult. No, because you've got an adaptive assessment, we can make the assessment, 1, we can make it shorter, and 2, we can actually pinpoint more easily which the level or the ability of each child. And it helps with things like cheating and things like that, because if you've got you can assess when you want on different days, it's unlikely that the students will see exactly the same questions as their friends. So it gives you that flexibility as well. When we get to mid-year, so this is secondary, I don't have a favourite chem assessment. Well, I think if I had to pick a favourite chem assessment, mid-year might be it. And that's really because I love the skills section. So you've got those 3 core skills that we're looking at, which we mentioned before. So you've got vocabulary, mathematics, non-verbal, but with mid-year you've also got skills. So what skills is, you can see how your students perform under time pressure. So you can see, a lot of questions, they might be a little bit easier if you can take your time. But sometimes if you've got that clock ticking away in the corner of the screen, just like they will do eventually when they come to do high stakes exams like GCSEs, how do they perform under that kind of pressure? And there's another section, part of the skills, which is proofreading their work in English. Again, that's a really, really core skill that they'll need to be able to do when it comes to exams. So you can actually see from the age of 11 or 12 which students might need a little bit more support in this area, because I'm sure you'll know from your own teaching experience, you might have students a student that you can think of in the class who really, keen, academic, really tries hard, but when it comes to, class-based tests, they just don't seem to do as well as you would expect them to do. It might be that one contributing factor is things like the ability to work under time pressure, the ability to be able to check work quickly in English for mistakes. So you get that insight with midges. So that's why I really like this assessment. It's only 50 minutes long, just one session, 50 minutes, so it's really quick as well. You don't need to spend a long time with this. Typically, schools will be doing this at the beginning of the school year, certainly in the first term or the first half term. And you also get grade indicators for Cambridge IGCSEs or any exam board that you might be doing. So what some schools have told me is this can sometimes help the school itself with choosing which subjects they offer at GCSE. You might find that you've got students who your cohort has particular strength in something like art and design, so you decide to offer that. And also it can help have some of those conversations about subject choice as well. But either way, you've got a whole sort of 4 or 5 years before students go on to do their actual GCSEs. So you've got lots and lots of time to work on any areas that you think that might be of concern for particular students. YELIS is pretty similar to MIDIS. One thing I think which is nice, which you also get in MIDIS actually, is the value added report. So this is a report that tells you what's the difference between what a child was predicted or most likely to get at in a GCSE subject and what they actually got. So as a school, you can see, okay, the maths department, for example, seems to be adding maybe a whole grade when it comes to their score. Maybe the biology department is not doing so well. So how can we transfer that best practice? Is there a reason for that? Have we invested more in the maths department than the biology department? Is it something that we can do, teacher training, or, there's lots of different things. So giving you that, that's just a couple of examples of how you might use value added. And you can also look at this throughout the years. So, if you've put in interventions and you've investment, you can actually see, hopefully a few years down the line, you're going to get a higher value added as those interventions and investments start to produce really good results. Alice is our post-16, and we give predictions for IB, if you're doing that, and also A-level. And what's quite nice about this is that you get predictions, you get 2 points of predictions. You get predictions based, if they've done GCSEs, based on the GCSE scores, and you also get predictions based on the Alice assessment itself. And that's quite useful because you might have, for example, a student who might have underperformed at GCSE. So we don't want to maybe lower expectations of that student. They could be capable of a lot more. So it can be quite useful to look at both predictions. And of course, again, you might have students who didn't come from an IGCSE background. So it's good to see what their predictions for A-level or IB are, regardless their educational background. So that was a quick whiz through all those assessments. If you want to look at any of this in more detail, then go to the website. You probably, if you're in a country where you have a local Cambridge representative, then please contact them and they can arrange looking at some of these assessments in a little bit more detail for you. So on the next slide, I just wanted to give a couple of examples of the reports that you get, and looking at the present, what's our situation now, what can we actually do with this data to plan when we're looking at teaching. So on the left, there is a report, one of the reports that we have for INCAS, which is primary. So you can see you've got one student's report there. You've got their reading score, which is 8 years and 3 months, and their actual age is 9 years and 1 month. So you can see that they are around about, nearly a year below where we might expect a child to be of that exact age. And you can see the breakdown of scores as well. So you've got word recognition, word decoding, comprehension, and spelling. So you can see which are the particular areas that we might want to support this child. And you've also got that developability. So that's the picture vocab and the non-verbal. On the right-hand side, this is from MIDIS. So you've got a standardized score here. So 100 is what we'd expect a child of that year group to achieve, around about 100. And then you've got their vocabulary, mathematics, non-verbal skills, and their overall ability score as well. So again, you can sort of look at individual students, where are their strengths, where are their weaknesses, how well can we best support them. I wanted to look at the INCAS one on the left a little bit more, and give maybe a couple of ideas of how you could actually use that when it comes to teaching and planning. So as I said before, for each overall score, reading, developability, mathematics, you get a breakdown into sub-skills. So if you're a teacher and you were looking at this information, you get a quick understanding of which area the child most struggles in. So in this case, it's comprehension and word recognition. So you can look at this at an individual point, in an individual sense. You can also look at this as a class as a whole. So you might, for example, see that on the whole, all your class seems to be struggling with this. So when you're using your teaching resources and your curriculum, how can you actually plan to focus a little bit more on these skills? Because remember, by focusing on these core skills, you will see improvements across the curriculum. So it's not just in English. You'll see as they get better word recognition, or better comprehension, you'll start to see improvements in things like science as well. One thing that I would also say is, don't worry if you see low scores. This information is designed to help you. It's not something that you need to share externally. It's designed for student and school level improvement. On the next slide, I'll quickly whiz through this. So you get an individual report and you get a class report. So again, if you've got a cluster of weak students, for example, how are you going to help them? Here, for example, is an idea of how you can think about differentiation in the class and using your resources. So you might have found that some of your students particularly struggle with general maths, while the majority of your class excel at it. So how do you differentiate? How do you actually teach the individuals within the class themselves? So you might want to do something like this. So looking at focus, practice, and challenge type activities. So focus would be something that students who struggle, they might need to spend a little bit more time on this type of activity, whereas challenge, when they get to that, is for when they're feeling confident to try something a little bit harder. So some students might not get to the challenge in the lesson. You might want to do it for homework. And if the parents want to know, what you're doing, why you're doing it, using external data like can help you, or it can be quite a good starting point in parent-teacher conferences to communicating with them what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you're helping their child's attainment. Last bit from me on the next slide is, again, one way to see improvement across all subjects, math, science, humanities, is to improve those core skills of reading and maths. So here, for example, you might want to focus on word recognition, word decoding, and looking through your resources for activities that can help those sub-skills. And of course, once a student has completed the activities, you can assess them with curriculum-based progression tests to see if they've improved, and then plan next steps. So in that way, you're using curriculum-based assessments as formative assessment. So these are just a couple of quick ideas on how to use data introspectively to link baseline assessment with teaching plans. And now John's going to talk about using data with a more external view and how to track progress against your targets.
Lovely, thanks, Natasha. I think just before we move away from the present and looking at the present at the moment, it's I think one of the things is always really quite interesting, and this is, again, comes back to benchmarking, but how does your school compare to other schools, similar schools, whether in the same country, the same region, the same association, or the same curriculum. So actually benchmarking can be really quite useful when you start trying to understand where you sit, because we need to remember as well that the data we're looking at isn't necessarily something that's I suppose inherently, that personal, but actually, or in terms of where you are in a range, but actually from a statistical point of view, it can be really quite insightful, simply to understand why you are where you are, and then what you can do about it. Now, obviously what we want to do, as I said before, we want to be able to look forward once we've got our students, as Natasha's already talked about, which is how do we support the student right now using the data right this second in the classroom to improve outcomes for the student. And absolutely that's what we do, but ultimately we want to be looking forward as well, and we want to be able to track progress as a student moves forward through the school. So you have an example through for a progress chart from INCUS on your left hand side there. Now what you're seeing here is no matter when the student is tested, you can see all the results are going to be in the context of the age that they are when they sat the test. And you can see, again, as you're looking forward, where you would expect a student to end up being. And importantly as well, I think when you've got something, especially from a mid-year point of view, from secondary onwards, where we start predicting to those high stakes outcomes a little bit further on, you understanding what the spread or the likelihood of those outcomes are can really start to inform productive conversations, not just with the student, but actually with their parents as well, which is engaging those key stakeholders in where those targets, where those developments might get set. Just a quick note on the predictions themselves, by the way, in case you're wondering where they all came from. The predictions come from like children or the students of like ability who've gone on to achieve particular exam results in the past. So the results and the predictions that we make are based on actual results. So students of a similar ability, those core skills, what they've actually gone on to achieve in the past. And then all of this gets fed into the predictions process. So we're actually making predictions based on actual results. So these aren't just algorithmic or statistical models, but they're actually information, bits of information that are actually critical to understanding not just what the student or what the likelihood of a particular grade might be for a particular student, but actually what it might look like from a whole school level there. You can see in the red bars. Now, the opportunity as well to inflate or deflate those predictions is really important as well, because this is where we're going to get to the looking backwards part in a little bit later. But just for the moment, it's, well, how do I take all of that? How do I take all of that and use it productively within the school? Well, here's a quick example. Just don't try and focus too much on the table itself and what's in it. It's just an example. But you can see we've got an example of a particular student, for example, and you've got the different results or the different subjects, sorry, down the left-hand side. Then you've got our results, so in terms of what we would predict would happen. You've got the target grade, which through discussion with key stakeholders you'd set for the students, and then as you will do as a matter of course throughout the course of that academic journey, you're going to test academic progress. So we've got potential, we've got the potential that's informed by their skills and the abilities. Actually, what are they doing in the classroom? So what is their academic progress like? Now, what you can then start to do, and again, based on observation, so this is where you start to triangulate the data, and all of your different data sets start to come together. You start to sort of say, well, how much effort is that student putting in? How engaged are they in the classroom? And then obviously you can start looking for where all the inconsistencies might be. So, well, okay, well, are they performing above or below where we'd expect them to be? Have we got any areas of concern in terms of where their engagement might be in a particular subject or as a whole? And all of this, even putting all of your data sources together, might not answer all of the questions that you have, but it will certainly help you ask the right ones. If you need to focus on a particular area, whether that might be in the case of this particular student here, you really want to start focusing on English and history. So you can see there actually some of the languages and humanities the student might be struggling with. Well, why might that be the case? Because clearly they're disengaged or starting to disengage with the student, with the subjects based on their ability. But actually based on their effort, but based on their ability, they're actually capable of an awful lot more. So are there reasons behind that, and what might they be? Once again, this is about how you can use the data to start informing targeted interventions. So the one-size-fits-all rule, it might work sometimes and it might work in certain scenarios, but actually if you've got a student in a situation like this, then often a one-size-fits-all solution probably isn't going to be the answer for you. You really want to get to the root, the cause of exactly what is causing that degradation in students' progress in a particular subject or subjects, and then you can actually start to do something about it. Now, looking back, which is really quite interesting as well, so obviously the reporting suite that you're going to get is going to allow you to look back. It's going to allow you to track progress and trends over time. So what might that be? So if you remember in terms of the INCUS chart that you saw here, in terms of that progress over time, if you look back, was there a particular point where the progress was above what you expected it to be, or was there a point where it actually dipped? And was there a reason behind that? Because you can really start delving back down into the data. By the time you look at, again, midges and yellows, and this is where you start getting the value in terms of the results. So what's happening with the results from the school's point of view? Now in this sort of area, you can say, okay, well, we had a drop in this. You can explain using objective data to either key stakeholders, boards of governors, or school owners, why a certain something might have happened, and you can start investigating why. And after that, obviously, you start putting your interventions, your plans in place to change things around. So you can then, interestingly as well, when we start looking back, evidence quite clearly that what you've done has had a positive impact and it's going in the right direction. And again, you can see here, we're looking at the post-16, so we're looking at Alice. You can look at this from a whole school level, actually by subject as well, which is really powerful for the school to help the start of school manage exactly where the performance is over time, simply by looking back and doing your lessons learned. So once again, the reports are not answering all of your questions for you, but they're certainly helping you ask the right ones. Now, what does it look like? What does it look like in terms of when you start planning? Well, it's quite interesting when you start doing it, because as I said before, what you really want to start doing is triangulating your data. So chem data on its own will give you a piece of the puzzle. We saw right at the beginning with the pie chart, it's only one piece of the puzzle. It's an important part, but it's not the whole. So what we're trying to do is trying to bring all of the data points together. Once we've brought all of the data points together, this is quite interesting, because then you can start having a conversation with your stakeholders. You know, what success looks like, what can you do, what are those targets going to be? And ultimately, as time moves on as well, you can start comparing those outcomes, those goals, You can start understanding what went wrong, what went right, what should we be doing more of, what should we be doing a little bit less of. Now, it's at this point you can start as well having a conversation, well, not just this point, but it's at this point you start reviewing with your department heads, with your classroom teachers, from a whole school level, because the more you can start getting your staff, your stakeholders engaged in using data to inform and make decisions moving forward, then you've got that consistency, that benchmark in terms of what you look for at the next step. Now, based on that, I'm going to draw it to an end a little bit now. So what we're going to do is we're going to answer any questions that you might have got over the course of the webinar. Kate's obviously been beavering away in the background, looking at all the questions. As I said before, and as Kate said earlier, we're looking at the record, we've been recording it, and we'll make sure that the recording of the slides sent over you towards next week. So, and don't forget, obviously, to sign up for the next one on the 23rd of June. So please do engage, please do ask any more questions that you might have. Kate, what questions do we have?
So we've actually got quite a lot of questions, so we're running out of time, so we won't be able to answer all of them today, but I can say to everyone that we'll collate any questions that we can't answer in the session. We'll collate the answers to and share those via email with the webinar recording and the slides. So the first one we've got here: can the Cambridge Chem baseline test be repeated during the year to measure incremental progression, or is there an alternative offered?
Excellent. Do you want me to take that, Natasha, or would you?
Yeah.
Okay. As we said, as we mentioned earlier, the purpose, I think, of the baseline is providing that starting point. So we're trying to look at the skills and the abilities of a particular point in time. And that often is at the start of the journey. In terms of measuring that progress over the course of the year, what we usually find is that the progress that you want to measure, or you end up measuring, is content related or attainment related, based on what the student has learned or what the student might not have learned over the course of that period. What we test at Chem isn't necessarily the content of that curriculum. So what you'd be trying to test is the raw or underlying ability of the students over time. Now, currently, what we do from primary onwards, we just look at that dipstick, that point, once in an academic year. The early years that Natasha mentioned in terms of aspect and base, they do offer an end of year or end of period test as well, so you can actually draw progress over the course of that year. Partly because they're such distinct and unique and well-defined points or periods in a student's learning. What we tend to do when we start looking at primary, we're looking at the journey across the whole of primary, so we measure year on year. And by the time we get to secondary, we're trying to look at that progress and where we're going to get to at the end of the journey. Schools often will test independently from year to year, but they tend to come in and they'll test at key points, not necessarily into year, but actually across the years as well. So it's used as a much longer range view. In terms of alternatives, often the alternatives that you might use might be in-house solutions, or they might be additional third-party providers, which might be reading tests in particular, if you know you've got language abilities. If you've got the likes of the progress tests in particular, and you're using those, I know we had about half of the audience using progress tests and checkpoint. And again, these are the kinds of measures that will combine as a Cambridge suite, rather than looking at any one of them in isolation. So we fit one part of the puzzle, or Chem fits one part of the puzzle, but actually the rest of the Cambridge pathway completes the rest of it. I hope that answers the question. Are you still on mute, Kate?
Sorry about that. Thank you, John. Another question here: can this baseline assessment be used for English as a second language students?
Yes. So we have lots of international schools throughout the world using this assessment, and in my case, in Middle East, North Africa, international schools sometimes means mostly, let's say, British people who live in the country, but the vast majority of international schools actually consists of students who don't speak English at home, who come from a variety of different backgrounds. So the Chem baseline assessment is designed for any student who is being taught in the English medium language. So usually that would be English medium curriculum. So typically it's British curriculum schools, but you don't have to be let's say a native British person to be using them. As I said before, the developed ability or the non-verbal, that's particularly useful when you're looking at students who don't speak English quite at the level where we want them to yet, because those questions tend not to have any English at all in them. It's sort of logic and patterns and that sort of thing. So those questions are really accessible for students. What I would say is if your school is, teaching all the subjects in English, it's really useful to have a baseline which measures students against other students who are in the English medium curriculum, because those students who are maybe in primary school, eventually they're going to go on and do GCSEs. They do need to be able to access the curriculum in English. And the sooner that you have that information, the sooner that you can actually do something about it and put interventions in place to support those students. Some schools, for example, they said that they have a bit of wiggle room in their timetable, so they can actually add, for example, an extra 45 minutes per week for those students to accelerate their English.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Natasha. That's really, really helpful. I think we're running out of time. We're actually slightly over time. I just want to ask one more question. Someone's asked, what are non-verbal skills?
Go ahead, John. Non-verbal skills, as the name might suggest, they're non-verbal. So often there might be patterns, rotated objects, there might be reflected objects, it might be speed of thinking in terms of pattern recognition from one part of the screen to another part of the screen. What's the interesting thing, and I think one of the more critical things from my point of view, is that actually the non-verbal element, they don't require memory. So there's no requirement for memory. It is quite simply the speed and agility that a student is able to think. And especially in a second language setting, I think having that kind of measure is really quite critical, because it starts to give you the ability to triangulate between the vocabulary score and understanding what might be driving that and what level it might or could or even should be at, and actually how able or how mentally agile a student might be in terms of that non-verbal ability that doesn't require necessarily language ability, doesn't necessarily require curriculum knowledge, but it actually does help you give an impression of exactly how, I suppose, mentally nimble and able a student might be, how quickly they will grasp, as Natasha said earlier, new and different concepts through a curriculum, regardless of what subject you might be looking at.